And we're coming to the last session of the day, and it's on the agency model. And today we've got Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, who knows a lot about agency. And so a warm welcome to Steve.
Please. EV sales in the agency model, everyone is interested in agency. Everybody should be interested in agency, whether you're a franchise dealer, an independent, or working around the edges. To the extent that agency becomes a significant part of the scene, it will affect the industry in many ways in terms of the used car market, the opportunity to sell warranties and finance and so on into the market and so on. EVs just add another twist to it. So some of what I say is specific to EVs, some of it is generally true about agency. For those of you who don't know ICDP, then just a very brief introduction. ICDP has been going now for 30 years. Yeah, 30 years. It was originally set up not far from here, Solihull, as a European organization. Over the years, we've done bits in other markets as well outside of Europe, as a collaborative research program. So we have members shown on the sort of top right of the slide there from across the industry, so manufacturers, some big distributors, dealer groups, OE suppliers, parts distributors, software providers, and so on. So it's a very, very broad church of members who pay a fee each year, and we run one set of research, one set of outputs. It all goes to everyone. It's entirely open. We tend to upset somebody all the time, but probably next year we'll upset someone else on a different topic. So we just report on the facts as we see them and how we see them developing, and it's about the future of car distribution. So we're not the people to come to find out what the profitability is in the Polish car market this year compared to last year. But if you want to know where we think the market's going, then that's what we do. And then around that, we do some consultancy, mainly for the members, but also for some other third parties, and we have some data services. So that's ICDP, and it's on the back of the discussions that we have with all of those members and with other players in the industry, and looking sometimes outside the industry, that the research is based and my comments are based. So if we step back a little bit from agency and just say, well, why should the distribution model change? We've been doing this for 100 years or more. I've got a copy of How to Run a Dealership Manual written by André Citroën in about 1930, and it still reads quite well today. So there's a strong argument to say, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But we would argue that it is broken and it's no longer fit for purpose. The reasons for that, as shown on the slide, firstly, cost of distribution. So some of you will be familiar with the sort of view that the cost of distribution is 30% of the retail price of the car. There is some foundation for that, but not many people under normal circumstances pay retail, and a big chunk of that is actually the discounts and rebates and so on that are given to the customer. Also, a lot of the costs are not actually the result of decisions made in distribution. They're results of decisions made to launch a product that no one ever wanted in the first place, and then ends up being discounted, or running the factories at a particular volume and ending up with oversupply. So distribution is where the cost ends up. But it's a fact that, give or take, 30% of the retail price of a car is tied up in some way with distribution, and that's unacceptable when you think that that's more than the total cost of assembly and product development in terms of the per car cost. The second one, and in some ways the more compelling one, because it's here now and we need to deal with it, is providing effective omni-channel. So omni-channel as opposed to multi-channel is that you've got all those different channels, you've got the dealership, you've got online and so on, perhaps some other elements. And the customer should have the free the flexibility to freely choose which channel to use at which stage of their journey, be able to switch between one or the other and not have an interruption. So they don't have to explain where they've got to, they don't have to re-explain what their trade-in is or what finance option they're looking at or whatever. So they should be able to switch between channels easily, and you can't do that well in a franchised system. Then the manufacturers think it would be, particularly the premium manufacturers, think it'd be a good idea if they had direct access to the consumer. Now, that is true of many brands. What they will actually do if they did have direct access to the consumer, and whether they do it well, is a different question. But the fact is that that's what they would like to have, and they do to some extent have that already. You know, as we get connected cars, the data is going to the manufacturer. They know what that car is doing. They know what's required in terms of repair, for example, on that car. And now increasingly they can put updates back onto the car. So there's a two-way data communication. And then the online channels are obviously run by the manufacturers, perhaps with some agency support. But they do have that access, but they'd like to have more. And then again, more of a premium brand issue. They would like a more consistent brand experience. And anyone who's in the franchise space or has been in the franchise space will be very familiar with that in terms of how it translates into dealerships being called, you know, Audi Oxford as opposed to the name of the investor. The same look and feel in the dealerships through CI, defined processes, and so on. But all of those are challenges to the existing distribution model. When we then look at electrification, and that adds sort of some new elements into the mix. So as it stands today, the product cost, you know, is higher on a battery electric vehicle than it was on the IC engine vehicles before. Now, there's continuous development of the technology and the costs will fall, but as it stands and as a trigger for change, the manufacturers are looking at a much higher product cost, an affordability issue in terms of what the customer was willing to pay, reducing amounts being contributed by governments in all parts of the world through subsidies to the purchase, and so the margin was being squeezed in total, and they need to try and get some cost out somewhere. Obvious place to look is that 30% cost of distribution. Second point is that, as you're all aware, we have this roadmap that takes us through to 2035 at European level in terms of CO2 reduction, and the manufacturers need to ramp up the percentage of the cars which are low or zero emissions every year, and perhaps depending what happens to the government and how many U-turns they make, in the UK we might be one of the first to try to get to 100% zero emission sales in 2030. But they have a product which has got affordability issues, but they have an absolute need to sell them somehow, to get that volume out there. And then the third area, which I think is relevant, and I know this was covered this morning, is the residual value risk. And that's sort of a moving feast. So demand for used EVs is now increasing, so that helps. People are more familiar with it, so that helps. But on the other hand, you've got variables that you didn't have to the same extent in an IC engine car. So if the BEV has been continuously put on high-speed chargers, then the battery life of that car is less than one which has always been put on a slow charge overnight at the customer's home, for example. We just heard about damage. If the battery has sustained damage at some point, hidden damage, then that could fail. So, and that makes a difference between a car being worth something, particularly if we're talking about something like a Leaf or a Zoe or one of the lower priced cars. That could be the difference at 5 or 6 year old as to whether that car has value or actually has zero value because of the cost of replacing a battery. If you come back to the new car buyers' buying behavior, then you will perhaps believe, if you read some of the press, if you listen to some of the statements by some of the manufacturer senior people, that there can be a big shift to online. All cars will be bought online. We don't need dealers, or we don't need dealers in anything like the quantity and the role that we have today. That, frankly, is complete nonsense. If you speak to the manufacturer senior guys privately, then they will admit that when they say, oh, it's 25% online sales by 2025, well, it doesn't really mean 25% of the customers doing the whole journey end-to-end online. There's all sorts of fudge numbers that get built into those sorts of ambitions. But if we look at our consumer research, and we've been doing our own research now for 10 years, the number of people who want to buy a car entirely online, so the left-hand side of the slide, as you look at it there, well under 10%. And this last survey is taken sort of post-COVID. And there are some differences by age. If you look at the right-hand side, those who want to buy it entirely physically, so all the stages taking place in the dealership, is higher, but it's still sub 20%. So the bit in the middle, the 70% plus, want to do a bit of both, and that brings us back to omnichannel. If you look at the numbers there, the younger people versus the older people, then yes, younger people are a bit more enthusiastic about buying entirely online, but not enough to change your basic strategy. If you look at the BEVs at the bottom, then the percentage you ideally would like to buy online is higher. But I would argue that at this stage, that's not to do with the fact that anyone buying a BEV will want to, or more of them will want to buy online. It's to do with the fact that people who've been buying BEVs in the last 1 or 2 years are still basically early adopters, and so they're the ones who are coming out buying BEVs when people are still asking questions, but they're also the people with the latest smartphone. They're the people who got the Apple Watch. They're the people who want to buy online. So I wouldn't read too much into that BEV number, but it's still 15%. And in our view, will that edge up over time? Yes, it will. But if we're talking about a 5 to 10 year strategy, it has to be built around omnichannel. The other bit of data to support that, without getting into all the weeds, is about buyer behavior. So we have this time series now over 10 years. And you can see that the top line, the red line, is the dealer visits. So how many visits customers made to a dealership when they were buying their new car. And the bottom one is the number of dealers visited. And broadly speaking, it's 3 visits to 2 dealerships. They go to dealer A, they go to dealer B, then you go back to one of them and they do the deal, they sign the contract, and that's where we're counting it to. And so not only is that a relatively small number, they're already quite focused. Typically, half are down to the make and model before they start their physical shopping. But it's also a positive line. It's not going down, it's actually going up. And that's because they are better informed through their online research, and so they are more confident about going into the dealership because they're armed with much more data about the value of their trade-in, what finance deal to expect, what the sort of typical discounts are if we're in a discounting world. And so they're actually more prepared to visit the dealership. It's not that visit to the dentist that people always talk about anecdotally. And then on the right-hand side, because they're better prepared, because they're more committed, because they're only making 3 visits, then they're prepared to travel further. So the new car buyer and the after-sales customer will both travel further than they would have done 10 years ago. After-sales hasn't moved so much because that's an inconvenience. No one likes doing a service visit. But the new car buyer now, maximum time they will travel is an hour to buy a car. The average for a typical network in the UK today is 17 minutes. But if we cut the number of points in the UK by 50%, then that time goes from 17 minutes to 21 minutes. So we have too many dealerships, but we do still need dealerships. If we then look again specifically at the BEV side, then two areas where I think the dealer becomes even more important than perhaps someone is buying an ICE, around explaining the car itself. So that element of the sales process, which is just educating the customer. So I've had, my first EV was actually 5-6 years ago now. And so I've had two, and I had a third on order, which I just canceled because they're messing me around on delivery. But, you know, I'm an EV person, but I still almost screwed up the order for the latest one because of how the technology changes and moves on. And that's going to be true for everyone. Whether they're buying their first EV or they're buying their second or third EV, then the technology is moving on all the time, and that needs to be explained to them. And that's not just about the car itself, but also about charging infrastructure and things like that. And then the test drives, I'm not convinced that test drives in general are so important in the sales process for a new car. But for BEVs, they definitely are. And you see that in the numbers. The take-up of test drives is higher on the BEV models than it is on the ICE models because it's unfamiliar to many people. They want to see what it's like to drive. So those are two things which are difficult or impossible to do in the virtual world. If we then look at agency, then this sort of chart, I'm not going to go through all of it, but basically there are two types of genuine agency. The ones at the top are the ones where the manufacturer's name is on the invoice, the dealer gets the commission. The one at the bottom is where it's the dealer's or the agent's name on the commission, on the invoice. So the revenue is still flowing directly through the dealer. But it doesn't make any difference in terms of what the basic principles of agency are. And what's important to notice, firstly, that it's not new. There's been agency around for new car sales for 10, 20 years in some markets. And it's just come onto the radar screen here in Europe really in the last 2 or 3. Mercedes implemented in Sweden in 2019, along at the left-hand end there. And then other brands have come on board, and they've come on board in a bit of a rush, and we might talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. Some of these brands have got their plans well thought through, they're relatively well prepared, and there's a good chance it will work and it will stick. Others have thought, this is something we should maybe do because so-and-so is doing it. And so they're jumping on the bandwagon and they're not well prepared, and it probably won't go well. And some of them are also putting forward plans that are actually illegal and they don't count as agency at all, whatever they may say to you. In the context of EVs, it's worth sort of looking at the Volkswagen sort of group in the middle at the top there, who are launching on EVs, but all the contacts that we have with the company and with dealers who are involved in the negotiations at a European level, the expectation is that it will be rolled across onto the ICEs within 5 years or so. So the group as a whole is going agency, but they're just choosing to do it on EVs first. When we speak to dealers who've been involved in negotiations or who've actually implemented agency, and this is not just from here, this includes Genesis in Canada, BMW in South Africa, Mercedes in in Australia, and obviously a number of brands in Europe. But at the moment, Mercedes implemented, people like Stellantis and Volkswagen sort of deep in discussions. Then there's another heat map. So we saw one from Experian. This is the ICDP version. And the issues which are seen as less of an concern are over on the left. The issues that are the hot topics still under negotiation, still without agreement in some cases, are on the right. And so we group them into sort of 3 areas: the actual coming to a deal, so the bit when you've still got some influence, the bit about actually operating it in terms of what the initial agreement spells out, and then finally what might be further down the road that's not been spoken about yet but the dealers are concerned about. And I just want to pick up on the right-hand end that on the coming to a deal bit, then the thing which is probably of most concern to the dealers is how legacy is dealt with. Any franchise dealer will have spent significant sums of money creating a big dealership at the request of the manufacturer or with certainly the tacit support of the manufacturer, and then all of a sudden we're changing the basis on which they're paid, and all of that investment is not being recognized, or a good part of that investment is not being recognized within the financial model, the remuneration model for the dealer under agency. How it will work, the two big areas of concern, and it's coming out all the time, is the manufacturer's ability to manage pricing in the supply chain, because they have to take all the risk out of the equation. So in a genuine agency, the dealers cannot discount, and they cannot hold any inventory risk. But the dealers are not confident that the manufacturer, in turn, is actually able and ready to take on those responsibilities of pricing and supply chain management. And then what's a concern a little bit down the line is used cars. So if the manufacturer is selling the new cars through the agent, they're typically putting their finance on it. It's going to come back to the manufacturer at the end. Is that car still going to come to the dealer as a 3-year-old used car, or will the manufacturer actually choose to sell it direct or even on agency again and destroy the used car business? And that's something that affects both franchise and independents, because the independents obviously are also interested in what's happening to those 3-year-old used cars. The sort of final, or almost final comment, but the final content, if you like, is just around some of the proposals themselves, because the only active agency of any scale in Europe today is Mercedes in Sweden and Austria, and coming next year in Germany and the UK. Stellantis implement in June next year, come hell or high water, it seems. Everything else at the moment is still talk. It's not in place. We don't know what's going to happen. And there are some significant risks around the proposals and agreements that are being put into place. Firstly, some of them leave the dealers with commercial risk. That's not allowable under agency. So if you've got any commercial risk at all beyond the basic building and the time of your people, then it cannot be agency, and therefore the manufacturer cannot set the prices. Secondly, and this applies in examples like the Volkswagen proposals, where the agency products, the EVs, are free riding on the back of the franchise products. So if the EVs are not covering their full cost, and the requirement from the regulators is that it should be as if it was the only product they handled. So if it's not loaded with all the overheads, all the staff, everything that's required to sell those EVs in isolation from the franchise products, then it's not agency. The OEMs, in some cases, even where they're saying, well, it's not genuine agency, and this is one, I know, a concern for many UK dealers around some of the Volkswagen brands, they are still trying to steer the pricing, but they admit they're not compliant in other ways. It's non-genuine agency. Non-genuine agency is franchise. Manufacturers steering the prices in the franchise is price fixing, and that's illegal. And then finally, sort of lack of transparency on remuneration. That the way the regulations are written, there should be a separate line for rent of the facility from the agent to the manufacturer to conduct this business, and then there should be a commission. And although the manufacturers are all doing that, or the ones that we're working with and the ones we're aware of are working out those two elements, they bundle it all together and put it as one commission number. And that's probably something that the regulators will pay attention to as well. So the bottom line is that you need to, and the manufacturers and the dealers need to proceed with caution, because if the regulators come after them, then they'll be looking for any evidence that there's price fixing when all of the requirements of agency are not in place. And then finally, just to sort of wrap it up, how you go forward to meet those challenges of distribution, so not talking only about agency, really just depends on a number of sort of key questions. The first one is that in the modelling that we've done, financial modelling that we've done, we found it is possible to get a win-win-win, to get something that works for the customer, something that works for the dealer, something that works for the manufacturer. And those numbers are not impossible to reconcile in most cases. It's not all cases. Sometimes, some markets, some brands, their positioning, their order mix, then you get sort of some challenges. But in general, you can get a win-win-win solution. Second one is whether the manufacturer's actually got the retail skills to run this business. They are becoming the retailer that are employing you as their agents, as an extended part of their organization to conduct the business. If they haven't got the retail skills, then it will undoubtedly fail. And then the third one is whether they actually manage supply and demand, because under agency, they want, the whole idea is to reduce the discounting. Reducing the discounting means avoiding oversupply. Avoiding oversupply means they need to throttle back not only their own production, but that of their suppliers with whom they've reached volume agreements for a given price. And in the current situation, we're in sort of a false world because we don't actually know what will happen when we return to normal supply next year or whenever that happens to be. So, you know, Stellantis is going agency. Stellantis is a family of brands which historically have always been oversupplied, heavily discounted, lots of use of pre-reg and daily rental. Are they going to throttle back the production in order to support their agency implementation? They're not the only ones, but I just pick on that one as 25% of the European market. So with that, this presentation done, and happy to take any questions, John.
Okay, I was interested in, I think we all are, in your win-win-win model, and how that would pan out for dealers. And the other thing I was interested in, I mean, you're not Mercedes-Benz, but could you just give us from your understanding, what Mercedes is proposing, given that they're the most advanced in Europe probably on this, if that's not misrepresenting them?
No, I think Mercedes has been going down this route now since 2017 or something. So it's 5 years in the making to get to where they are today. And they absolutely understand that this is about retail. So I'm not saying that they have done it perfectly or they will do it perfectly or the UK will go well next year. But there's some positive signs. So when they went live in Sweden, they changed the hiring policy for the NSC, for example, for the importer, so that they will now only employ people into the NSC who've got retail backgrounds, retail skills. They won't hire somebody whose background is wholly in the wholesale model in the old sort of push environment. They have been flexible as they've gone market to market in their negotiations. They're not trying to roll out one size fits all. They're rolling out a set of principles, but they've been flexible as to what happens in the market. And in the UK market, Gary has, come up with his own take on that. Yeah. I'm not privy to what's in that. If I was, I wouldn't be able to share it.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But there's probably some people in the room who know that better than I do.
Yeah.
But I think they do understand it. They've taken time. They've rolled it out progressively, and so I would, not only because they're first, but also because of the way in which they're doing it, I would sort of set that at the moment as being the benchmark, the high benchmark of agency planning and implementation.
Yeah. And yes, in Australia, Australian Mercedes dealers, they're going to court.
They have. They've said that the goodwill that they've generated has not been recognised in the transition, and the goodwill has been lost. The Australian Dealer Association are members of our programme, partly because they're interested in agency. Right. But I'm still not sure I wholly agree with that view. Under agency, the manufacturer has the direct relationship with the customer on the new car invoice customer's name there, it's in the first instance Mercedes data. And then the customer will tick the boxes to allow the dealer to use that data appropriately. It's the reverse of today, where the dealer will be the primary data owner, and they'll tick the boxes to let the manufacturer use it under certain circumstances. But the first visit the customer makes into the dealership for an after-sales requirement, they become the dealer's customer. And so we've got two records anyway, one which is the manufacturer's, one which is the dealer's. And so I think that although it is a concern of many of the dealers in the negotiations at the moment in general, not talking about Mercedes, I think that will work its way through. And I think manufacturers in general will still ask the agents to communicate on their behalf to the customer, because the customer will see the agent as being the natural interface, not some anonymous person sat in Milton Keynes or Stuttgart or wherever it might happen to be. And I think we'd have some experience now of Mercedes dealers being sold in markets where they've implemented agency, and those sales have gone through straightforwardly without any apparent loss of value. So we'll see what happens in the courts, but I think that is a bit of an outlier.
Yeah, okay, fair enough, yeah. And you were saying there, do you feel that many dealers feel under threat at the moment, or is it that so many, just 50 networks are all doing a different thing, and it just depends on what they decide? I mean, Suzuki, for instance, is not going agency.
No, and they've got a great model that works for them. It's, everyone in the room is probably familiar with the Suzuki model as it works here, but it works the same in other markets. Suzuki in other markets, like here, come quite high in any survey of customer satisfaction and dealer satisfaction with the brand. But what Suzuki recognize is that they do not have the resources to take this on. Right. Suzuki nowadays has no European organization. Suzuki are members of our program, but the person we deal with is sitting in Japan in Hamamatsu.
Right.
So they don't have a European organization. They don't have big national sales companies. There's no way that they can take on the retail responsibilities, even if they wanted to. Okay. The model works for them. It works for the dealers.
If I could ask you finally, if there was any bit of advice that you could offer to dealers. I mean, dealers of whatever franchise. Is there any? What advice would you give?
I think at this stage, with the negotiations in many cases still underway, and particularly in the UK where you've got the big dealer groups who are core to the networks for most brands, then my advice would be to push back hard on the areas where there are concerns now. Yeah. Because once it's gone in, it's going to be more difficult, and you're going to have to work with what you've got. And it's not so much about the commission levels and so on. It's more about the capabilities of the manufacturer. Are they ready? Do they have the people? Do they have the processes? Do they have the systems? And do they have a legal proposition? Right. And if the dealers push back on that in any area where they have concern, then I don't think the manufacturer is going to terminate them all. Yeah. And say I'm sure they will slip the implementation if needed. And that is really what's required, because otherwise it's going to be an unholy mess. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, listen, thanks for your time today, presentation. Steve Young.
Okay, thanks, John. Thank you. Well, I think that the whole area around electrification is obviously one of the biggest sort of mega trends that the industry faces. It affects retailers as much as it affects the manufacturers and the broader public. And coming to an event like this, even as somebody working and hopefully informing the industry, you always still learn something yourself as well. There's always a different perspective, a new person you meet. So everybody has the opportunity to learn. It doesn't matter how many grey hairs you have, or whether you're supposedly in the informing and educating role, if you like, as opposed to the consuming role. You can still always learn. the actual program has covered the whole area, pretty much soup to nuts. Sales, after sales, targeting of customers, and so on. And they're all linked. They're all connected. So if you went to a session just on used, a conference just on used, you're getting one part of the picture, but what happens there is also influenced by what's happening on the news side, it's influenced by after sales and so on. So I think it's a good opportunity for people to get up to speed. And the speakers brought some new insights, some aspects I was familiar with, but when you look at, for example, challenges that some dealers are finding with getting finance accepted on an EV. I was aware of product-related issues, but not issues related to the individual customer. So that's an interesting insight for me. If you look at the opportunity to take data and to link general demographic data with the penetration of EVs, as we heard about this afternoon, then that's a great opportunity. You have to have the resources in order to use that. But the basic principles could still be taken on board by the smallest dealer. There's not a lot of point trying to sell EVs to somebody whose usage of their car, where they live, is clearly not a high prospect for that. I think I've seen some surveys where a quarter of dealers, franchise and independent, are saying, I will never sell EVs. Well, I guess they're leaving the industry then. That's just totally naive. You have to be prepared to move with the industry. It would be like saying, I don't know, 20 years ago, I'm never going to sell a car that's got anti-lock braking because I'm the master of cadence braking and I can do this. And I'm sure my customers can, therefore I don't need to sell a car with ABS. We can laugh at that sort of position now, but you can't turn your back on EVs. EVs are coming, whether it was the only option, that's an interesting point of debate, but it's still history now. EVs are coming, you need to be ready. And so the people who are here are clearly engaged and interested and want to learn more. Hopefully there's the majority of dealers who are out there would also like to know more, but were not able to come. Those who didn't come because they don't think they need to have basically written their own P45. You're better to have somebody who's enthusiastic, who has the attitude, who actually lives the EV, who has an EV, trying to sell those cars, than to force people into doing something that they don't believe in and have no interest in. So I think the problem is reducing, but it certainly was true in the past, relatively recent past, that in some dealerships the salesperson had never driven an EV, never lived with an EV. So they'd driven it on a test drive, but they never lived with it. And you have to live with it. My first EV was 5 years ago. So when you live with it, you understand all the issues about charging. You've actually experienced an odd occasion when the weather's been bitterly cold and the range has come down. You've experienced some occasion when the charging infrastructure was not working for you. And so you need to have lived that. And if you've got people in your sales force who haven't had that experience, you're probably better actively to keep them away from a customer who comes in and wants to buy a car. Otherwise, what happens is they do the easy option, and so they come in to buy a Zoe and they get sold a Clio. So that's the challenge. There's no harm in having some specialists, but they can't be there all the time, and so that number has to increase over time. Well, we cover the whole of distribution, so anything after the factory gate. So that includes things like mobility, after sales, sales, digitalization, franchise agreements, how national sales companies operate, anything after the factory. But electrification is affecting many of those things. So it has an impact on you, it has an impact on used, it has an impact on after sales, has an impact on financing, has an impact on crash repair. So It's one of the themes that really cuts across almost everything we do. You know, mobility. You've got specialist firms who are doing e-mobility, and that maybe has a particular role, but it also has a particular challenge. You can't put a car out for hire by the hour or by the kilometre if it's an EV and it hasn't got a full charge. People will still have individual ownership of a car, but you know, to your point, they will be more likely to lease it than to buy it, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But the leasing means you get over that initial hump. In the case of EVs, it means it's not your problem to worry about the impact on residual values if the technology changes. And once you're into that model of leasing and you no longer have capital tied up in the car, then it's difficult to come back out of it. So to some extent it's a one-way street for good or bad. And with the, today I was talking about agency models as opposed to franchise models, and the way the manufacturers will make that work for them in terms of managing pricing and financial support for the deal will be through doing leasing. So we'll continue to see a growth in leasing, but subscription in the sense of by the hour, or with extreme flexibility that you can send the car back after a month, then that's not going to work financially. The cost of the car, that 50,000 that you mentioned, still has to be covered. And whether it's sat on your driveway doing nothing or at the side of the road doing nothing, the owner of the car still needs to get £50,000 worth of cost recovered. I'm optimistic in the sense that we will still need independently owned motor retail, and I think that many of the companies and the individuals who are in motor retail today will still be in motor retail in 10 years' time, or maybe 15 or 20 years' time, clearly if they're not the age of you or I. But they will, the role that they play will be different, and the skills that they and their colleagues will need will be different. But there'll still be a role. There'll still be cars to fix, there'll still be cars to sell, there'll still be cars which have been used by someone else that need to be, found a new home.